Hey everyone. Chapter 6 is about JavaScript and accessing the DOM. If you remember, the DOM is the document object model. It's kind of the tree that JavaScript turns all the HTML on the page into so that you can traverse it. The book on page, which page is it? 165, goes into this a little bit, but I don't really like the diagram that the book uses on page 165. It's a little simple. So instead, I'm going to use this page that you see now, and this is from what used to be the JavaScript 2 textbook, and I think that this graph is a lot better. It's color coded and you can see more stuff inside of it. So I'm just gonna start with this and try to explain how it works. So on the left hand side we see a simple HTML page. It's just the HTML tag that everything has to have, and then the body tag, and then the first thing inside of the body tag is a div that contains everything, and it has an ID of page. And then inside of page, we have the div page. We have an H1, which is list, and an H2. You see that the H1 has an ID on it as well of header. And then we get to a UL, which is an unordered list. And then inside of the UL, we have 4 LI or list items. And then each of them have an ID of 1, 2, 3, 4. The first 3 have a class on them called hot, which is, for our purposes, these are just classes that are going to set a color. And then this very first one has an emphasis tag inside of it, this EM. So when this page will load, the JavaScript takes a snapshot all of it and makes a DOM tree. And then this is a pragmatic way for it to navigate inside and to access all the different parts of the page. Now the way it does that is there are several commands, such as parent node, child node, first sibling, next sibling, last child, first child. I think I already said last child, first child, next sibling in line, parent, so it can go up in the tree if it wants to. And we're just going to walk through just an example of how to traverse this DOM tree. So we have 4 different kinds of nodes. We have the document node. That's the very beginning that everything starts with. It's just the document. And then we have our element nodes. Now our element nodes are everything that's an HTML tag. So you can see it in green mint color here. So the HTML, the body, the div, the H1s, the ULs, the LIs, those are element nodes. Those are actual HTML elements that you type into your code. And then we have what's called attribute nodes. Attribute nodes are the attributes that are on each of the elements. Attributes are things like IDs or classes. Or if you're thinking of an A tag, it's the href. If you're thinking of JavaScript, it's the src, the source. Those are the attributes for an element. And then we also have text node. Text node is the words that are written out. So if we look over here at this H1, for example, we see it represented right here, this first 3. So the H1 is an element node, and it has an attribute. It has the ID of header, so it has an attribute node that sits off to the side of it. And then inside of it is the text of list, and list becomes a text node. So if we were going to use some of the built-in JavaScript things, and if we were going to start at body, and let's try to work our way down to getting pine nuts. So we would do something like a document.getElement by tag name on the body, and we would have the body. Or if we wanted to add an ID to the body, we could. And then we could just say document.getElement by ID, and that would be our body. And then we want to go one level inside of it. So we're going into its children, the body and its children. So we would say first child. And the first child is this guy, document, or div with an ID of page. Now remember, we're trying to get down here to pine nuts, so we still have to go down in our tree even further. So then we're in this div, and we have to go inside of this div now. Now we can go to first child, which would be this guy, and then we can say next sibling, and then next sibling to get to our UL. Or, since we know that UL is the second to last thing, we can say, all right, instead of going first child, which gets us to here, let's go to the last child. So we're going to start on this guy. So from the page, the div ID of page, we go to the last child. So now we're down here at script. And if we go over here to this side, it'll be easier to look at this way. So here we were at this div right here, and we went to the last child, which is the script. And then we go to previous sibling. That means the sibling right above it, which if we're going left to right, it's right over here. It's the UL. It's like, okay, cool. Now we're at the UL, and we have to start digging in, and our goal is to eventually get to right here, this LI. So let's go to, we're in the UL, let's go to first child. So that puts us to this LI, which is this one right here, the fresh figs. And then we go to next sibling, and that will get us to pine nuts. So this could be pretty confusing. Just understand that that when JavaScript looks at an HTML, it turns all of it into a tree, a flowchart, or you've seen trees like this where things burrow in. And then there's several JavaScript commands. There's the first child, last child, first previous sibling, next sibling, parent nodes. There's so many different JavaScript commands to worm your way into the thing you're getting to. So that's confusing. That's kind of hard to do, to burrow your way into what you're looking for like that. So that's why a lot of times we put IDs on elements that we want to hit. So instead of going into one and then going into its child and then going into that one's child, we'll just put an ID on the exact thing that we want to get to make things easier for us. So I have a browser, or I have the same thing typed into an HTML document over here. And then I have, so I mentioned we have those hot classes that we have on those first three LIs, class of hot. And then we look up here, and hot just sets the color to be red. I also have another one that's cool. We don't need that LI there. So we have a cool class. So for experiment, I'm going to make this third one, which is honey, which is right now has the class of hot. And I'm just going to give it the class of cool. So you can see what's going to happen. It's going to turn blue. And then any LI that does not have a class on it at all is just going to be the black color. So let's put hot back on there. And then let's see what this looks like. So you guys have probably by now been in here and looked in Chrome Developer Tools. Chapter 5 was all about debugging, and that has to do with going in here. Now, you may notice, now that you know that JavaScript is trying to create this DOM tree, we see it right here, that's exactly what's going on over here in our Elements tab. So there's our page, and we click this little arrow to open it up. We're going inside of it. These are the three children of div ID page. All right, let's open up the UL. We're digging into the tree even further. And here's all of our LIs. Here's all of the LIs in that nice little tree graph. And then we saw that first one had an EM tag for emphasis. So that's one more level that we go into for there. And that's what is showing right here on the Chrome DevTools, is we have one more little guy to jump into. And there's that EM tag. So I hope this gives you a better understanding of how JavaScript creates these DOM trees and how you can navigate them. Okay. So you're already familiar with get element by ID, but what you're not familiar with yet is accessing attributes of each of these guys. So I have this variable here, var cur ID, stands for current ID, the current one I selected, and it's document.getElementById of 1. And if we look up here in our markup, we have this li right here with the ID of 1. So over here in my Chrome DevTools, I have my console open, so this means I can start interacting with these variables I set. So cur ID is that guy, it's li, it's the one that we're after. So let's access some things on him. Let's see what attributes this guy has. So I say cur ID and then get attribute, and what attribute do I want to access? I want to access the class. Oh, whoops, the class attribute, and it says hot. So I know that this first li, or this first one right here with the div ID of 1, has an attribute. The class is hot. What if I want to check and see if this one does have an attribute at all? Like maybe it doesn't have, or if it has a class, for example. So I could say cur ID dot has attribute. So we're checking to see if this guy has a class. And it does have a class. That's good. Now let's change this cur ID that I have over here from being 1 to being 4. So that's as simple as changing what I'm selecting. All right, so now I say my current ID is 4. It's the 4th one, the balsamic vinegar. And let's do the same thing we did before, where I said cur ID dot, does it have a class attribute? Let's see if it does. It doesn't. False. So this is a good way of checking to see if something has a class added to it or if it has an ID added to it yet. Some of your in-project assignments will ask you to look for this. If it does not have a class, give it a class. And if it does have a class, skip over it. So this is how you can check and see if something has a class or not. Let's change this back to our first one. So just verify that we're on the first one. Cool. And now let's try setting the attribute. So we're going to say cur ID, and this time set attribute. And this takes two parameters. It's the attribute you're looking for. So in this case it's going to be class. I want to set the class attribute. And the second parameter is what class or what I want to set it to. So the current ID, which is this one right here, this first one, I'm going to set the attribute class to now be cool. So when I hit return, we see that it's now blue. And if I inspect it, we will see that its class got changed from hot to now being cool. Excuse me. Just a tip, on the final project, one of the things that you want you to do is to change attributes on something. And the way that it's shown in a lot of the demos is like changing a background color if you get an answer right or wrong. And so this can be as simple as on the body, set attribute class to correct, and then you define a correct class that has a background color of green or something like that. So that would be a simple and easy way of how you would set attributes and how you would show it to me in the final project. So, and then the last thing we can do with attributes, I already went over has attribute, get attribute, and set the attribute. Now, the fourth and final thing we can do with the attributes is we can remove an attribute. So I say remove attribute, and what attribute do I want to remove? It's going to be the class. So when I hit return on this guy, we see that it turned back to the black color, because that means there's no class set on him anymore. So this li with ID of 1 started out with the class of hot, but now since I removed the class attribute, it doesn't have a can't show a color anymore because the class is gone. All right, so get element by ID. That's if you want to select one thing. It'll pick the first one with that ID on your page, and if you're following semantic HTML, there should only be one element on your page with a certain ID. IDs have to be unique on the page. So let's say we want to select all of these LIs. So all 4 of these guys. Well, we can do get elements by tag name. Now what this will do is it'll go over your whole HTML document, and in this variable of list, it'll now be all of the LIs that it found on your whole page. It doesn't matter if they're next to each other or if they're scattered throughout the whole page. It'll be all of the LIs. So let's see what this looks like. So I set it to the variable of list, and then there we are. We have all of them. Now, this is an HTML collection. It's kind of like an array, but it's I don't want to say it's technically not. It's not really an array, but it is kind of like an array. You can access it like an array, but it's called specifically an HTML collection. And then inside of it are all of the LIs that are on our page. There's only these 4. And we get something like our length property, so we know how many we have. And if we want to change maybe the second one right here that says pine nuts, maybe give that guy the class of cool, then we access it just like we do any other array. They're indexes. And when we start counting in JavaScript, we start with 0. So 0 would be fresh figs li. 1 will be the pine nuts. So we're going to do a square bracket, and we're going to say 1. And, you know, Chrome DevTools is extremely helpful. It's already pointing out which one I'm selecting. And then I say set attribute. What attribute do I want to set? I want to set the class. And what do I want to set it to be? I want it to be cool. So that took the second one out of my list item that I have, my HTML collection, and set the color. All right, that's fun and all. Now what if I want to change all of these tags at the same time? I want to give all of these guys the class of cool and turn them all blue. Well, what we can do here is our trusty little for loops that we have. So we've learned about for loops. For loops are made to work with arrays. So I have a for loop. The first thing I give it is what to start with, what to start counting with. And it's usually, we almost always start with 0, because in JavaScript things start counting at 0. So I say var I equals 0. I is always the index. It's kind of just one of those things, wherever you see I anywhere, you just know it's the index. And then for how long do we want to do this loop? We want to do it for as long as I is less than list length. So list length is 4, because there's 4 of them. And then what do we want to do when our loop is done? We want to increment I. All right, so when this loop runs, it's the very first one. It's going to be list item 0, So it'll be the first one in the count. And we're going to set attribute class to cool. And then when that's done, we're going to increment I, so I is now equal to 1. So list 1, index of 1, will be pine nuts. Give it a class of cool. Increment again. List 2 will be honey. Give it a class of cool. Increment. List 3 is balsamic vinegar. It increments. So now the number is 4, and 4 is not less than the length, which is 4. So our loop is done. So now let's save it, and we'll see what happens. There we see all of them turned to being blue. All right. So that was get elements by tag name. You can also do, in the book on page 169, it also tells you about class name. So for example, if you wanted to flip all of the ones that were hot, so these 3 right here that have the classes of hot, and you wanted to flip just those 3 to being cool, then you can do get elements by class name hot, and then flip just those 3. And then that last one, this last one will just stay the black color because the class isn't added to him. We also have, you can do document get element by IDs, document get element by tag names, document get element by class names. We also have document query selector and document query selector all. So, and these work a little bit differently. Document query selector, just this first part, will be similar to get element by ID. It's only going to return the first one that it finds and do something with it. But we have this query selector all, which will select everything. Query selector and query selector all use class selectors. So just how you would write a class, like if you wanted to set a class on this EM, for example, right here, you can do .hot space EM, up here when you write your class. And then that will be the CSS only for this EM selector right here. And that's how these query selectors work. So let me go over a few examples of query selectors. All right, so I already have var all to document.querySelectorAll li. So it's going to select all of the li's. And if I just go over here to all, there they all are. But we notice one thing. This isn't an HTML list or an HTML collection. So list, when we use document get elements by tag name, is an HTML collection. But when we switch over to use query selectors, we get a node list. This is very confusing why there's node list, HTML collections, and arrays, and that kind of thing. If you want to learn more about it, because it's outside the scope of this book, you can just Google node list versus HTML collection or something like that, and you can read up about them if you want to. But it's beyond the scope of this class. They are a little different. They behave differently. So just know that there's a difference. But you can access them pretty much. They can do similar things. So let's go back to our for loop. And we're just going to change all these occurrences of list to be all. So we're going to loop over this guy. So now our loop is going to go over the document query selector all li. You won't see any difference in here. They'll all be blue, just like that. But it's just a different way of selecting things. Now, where this gets cool, cool, I didn't mean it like that. But since we can just write CSS selectors, I can do li.cool, or actually hot. And what this is going to be is it's going to be all LIs that have the class of hot. And then I'm going to loop over them and set the class of cool. So let's see what happens when I save this. Oh, we see that it only affected the 3 up here that had the class of hot on them, because we wrote our selector like this. So now if I say all, it's a node list of 3 items. And it's just these 3 right here. So query selector all is what I use for pretty much everything, or query selector if I'm going after just one, because that's a lot easier to work with. Here's just a quick example. We don't use for eaches in JavaScript 1. They're more of something that you move on to next, because you have to understand, we teach you for loops initially because it forces you to think in your head of the indexes of the arrays that you're moving through, because of these, you have to write out these long, complicated for loops. In reality, you don't need to use for loops. There's something in JavaScript called a for each, and what it does is it just loops over every single thing that's inside of the array. You don't need to index and increment the index. It'll just loop over every single thing that's in it. So if I hit save, this will change all of them to blue. And you see how that's just a lot cleaner to write instead of writing a big for loop like that. So here's where the node list and the HTML collections change. So remember our list that we have up here, which is the HTML collection, the get elements by tag name, and we used our for loop and it worked just fine. It changed all the LIs to blue. Well, if I try to do this in a for each, I'm going to get errors. So even though HTML collection looks like an array, it's really not an array, because if it was truly an array, then the for each would work on it. But since it's not, in order to loop over an HTML collection, you have to use a for loop to get all of them to work. So that's the big difference. We're not using the for each. I just wanted to show you that so you can see that you're not always going to have to write for loops. Once you get out of JavaScript 1 or anything you do on the side, you can do just simple for each statements. But you just got to remember, when you're messing with for each, you have to use the query selectors, not the get element by tag names or get element by class names, because those return an HTML collection, and what you really want is a node list, which functions like an array does. So the rest of chapter 6 is just reapplications of the same things I just showed you. Getting attributes, setting attributes, and that kind of thing. Working with forms a little bit to access form data, and so you have get element by ID, get element by tag name. You also have get element by name. And then this works when you have fields, like a lot of times with input fields, you'll give it a name of some kind. You'll see it when you get to that. I think they start talking about it on page 177 in your book. But I think this is everything you need to get really explained to you for the rest of chapter 6. Chapter 6 does some fun stuff. You get to start writing some real apps in it. So I'm going to finish this up for today, and I hope that made sense. If you have any questions, just message me, and I'll try to explain better. Yeah, all right, see ya.